John from Digital Foundry here with a closer look at what we know about the upcoming Uncharted, the Nathan Drake collection, being developed by Bluepoint Games and Naughty Dog for release this October. We spent some time recreating the new story trailer that was just released using scenes from the original Uncharted games on PlayStation 3. Doing so enabled us to get a better idea of what to expect in terms of visual changes. The jump in frame rate is the most obvious and significant change, of course, but a lot of additional work seems to be going into this collection to make certain that it isn't just a run-of-the-mill remaster. What's really surprising here is that the overwhelming majority of scenes presented in the latest trailer are pre-rendered sequences on PlayStation 3. That means we're looking at a much improved presentation across the board, just as with The Last of Us Remastered, where all scenes are upgraded to match the full 60 frames per second gameplay. It's not clear if these scenes will remain pre-rendered in the final game, but if The Last of Us Remastered is anything to go by, it seems likely that they will, which of course begs the question, can Bluepoint really fit that much 1080p 60 frames per second video on a single Blu-ray disc? Or are we looking at a multi-disc collection here? Perhaps they may even surprise us and switch to a fully real-time cutscene implementation. There are nearly 70 different cuts in this new trailer, so we've decided to break them down on a per-game basis, starting with Drake's Fortune. As a 2007 release, the original Uncharted really only scratched the surface of what Naughty Dog would go on to deliver on PlayStation 3. The Nathan Drake collection appears to offer many improvements designed to bring the game in line with its sequels. Take this sequence from early in the game, for instance. It immediately showcases a number of important changes. Take a close look at the aircraft, and you'll notice an increase in texture detail and improved shading across the board. Below, we can also observe a change to the water surface shader, which features a much denser pattern than the original game. As Nate leaps from the plane moments later, we're given a glimpse of distant terrain rendering. The underlying mesh appears to have been greatly enhanced, while higher resolution textures and improved shading help create a more cohesive scene. Low-hanging clouds are even added to the mix for a bit of extra atmosphere. Later on, when Nate discovers the remains of Sir Francis Drake himself, we're given a look at the improved textures and modeling on non-critical elements. These changes are most evident in the chest armor and hair, both of which sit more naturally within the scene. Nate's wristband is also much more detailed, while the addition of contact shadows gives the scene additional depth. From another angle, we can also see improvements to the armor mesh in the lower corner of the screen. Note how much more rounded it appears. This close-up of Nate also demonstrates his new skin shaders, improved hair rendering, and higher resolution textures. Note the extra stitching and detail on his shoulder strap, for instance. One of the earliest scenes in the game shows Nate and Elena escaping an exploding boat. Aside from the strange angle on his wrist there, we can actually see some completely revamped explosions. Also note the railing mesh. Geometry has been added to the mesh as a whole, resulting in a rounder appearance, which can be easily observed if you look at the contact point with the boat. Once in the water then, we see an improved ocean shader up close. Contact shadows and improved plane textures are also evident, enhancing the overall scene. The bridge sequence gives us a look at a larger space. The base geometry seems to remain mostly unchanged, but the improved lighting and shadows along with a nice depth of field help create an overall richer scene. Moments later, as Elena falls through the bridge, improvements are less evident, though again, the depth of field used in this scene definitely adds a bit of cinematic flair. The same can be said of this section, which benefits greatly from the effect. Depth of field, ambient occlusion, and improved bloom lighting enhance this scene. Lastly, if you look at Nate's torso here, the change in shadow quality between the two versions becomes rather evident. Next, let's move on to Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. The changes aren't nearly as dramatic as Drake's Fortune, but there are still plenty of improvements. In this scene, a number of subtle improvements make their first appearance. First, you'll note the inclusion of higher resolution textures applied across the scene geometry. This becomes more evident when the camera pulls in for a close-up. Look at the rock wall directly behind Nate's head, for instance. Changes to shading are also evident. Nate's shirt, for example, now appears slightly less glossy and more natural. There's even an additional layer of moving clouds present in this scene, along with slightly stronger depth of field. Then we move on to the famous train escape sequence. Improved shadows stand out, while the vinyl seats now sport more realistic, specular highlights. Even the metallic bottom of the falling seat exhibits more realistic materials properties. In a completely different scene, we noted an improved rock mesh beneath Elena's head with higher resolution texture work in addition to sharper facial textures, as you can see here. This next explosive sequence shows a minor difference in the way explosions are rendered, along with increased depth of field and changes to the background geometry mesh. We're given only the smallest glimpse of the famous train sequence, but these little tufts of grass along the bottom of the screen demonstrates a lack of motion blur on PlayStation 4. The rest of the scene appears very similar, with only a very subtle increase in detail, but this lack of blur is troubling, as it was present in the original version. Some other details. In this scene we see sharper texture detail and stronger lighting. In this next shot, observe the sharper texture work on the ancient platform, along with generally improved shading. And now we're on to Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception. While there are fewer improvements visible in the third game, it's still worth noting some of the changes. In this initial shot, for instance, we see softer shadows, along with a better implementation of ambient occlusion. Take note of the points of intersection inside the glass case. Shadows cast on young Nathan's face appear more diffused and natural on PS4, while his clothing receives higher resolution textures. Even Sully's pants receive some extra attention to detail. Curiously, the focal point used for depth of field has been changed in this remaster. The shallower depth of field present on PlayStation 3 in this particular scene has been changed for PS4. Also note how the clipboard on the back wall has been shifted up. Young Nathan also sees a change in hair color in addition to sharper textures all around. Here the new focal length also comes into play, where you can see it pushed out a little bit on PS4. This short walk to the plane highlights a few important changes as well. Most importantly, thanks to the oblique angle of the tarmac, we can see anisotropic filtering in effect in this remastered version of the scene. Also note the higher resolution shadow map cast on Drake's torso. In this next scene we actually see a shallower depth of field on PS4, along with some refinements to shading and lighting. Note the variation in color present in Drake's face. This next shot then showcases further improved texture work and higher precision shadows. Depth of field is also added to this scene, resulting in a more dramatic frame. The shape of individual light elements almost suggests a sort of bokeh depth of field here. Of course, until now, every scene we've examined was originally pre-rendered on PlayStation 3, but these last few shots were taken from real-time gameplay. The most crucial difference we're seeing at this point is the lack of motion blur. As with the train sequence in Uncharted 2, all of these moments in the third game make great use of this effect. As Nate jumps to the plane, for instance, the PS3 version of the game uses motion blur to enhance the sensation of speed of the tarmac. This can also be observed as Nate is blown out of the same plane just a few minutes later. As his body flips through the air, motion blur is used to accentuate his movements. Now, the shutter speed was previously adjusted for The Last of Us Remastered, changing the appearance of this effect in that game, yet with Uncharted, it actually appears to be completely absent on PS4 at this time. Of course, there's still time before the game ships, so we'll remain hopeful. After all, Uncharted 3 originally shipped without motion blur enabled at all, something that had to be added in a patch later. So that about wraps it up. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the full trailer on the site, and if you like what you see, go ahead and click subscribe below.